views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to Bronxtalk. In the aftermath of the recent terrorist attacks in Brussels and Pakistan and the November attacks in Paris, logically, questions have been raised about the relative security of New York City in our subways, our public gatherings, and other locales that might be terrorist targets. Though officials say that today's shooting at the U.S. Capitol was not the work of foreign terrorists, it certainly has the effect of raising our antenna and concern for public safety. Tonight we have two experts with us who will review how safe we are in New York and how safe we might be around the world. If you'd like to weigh in on Homeland Security or ask questions, then don't hesitate to pick up the phone and call in. The number is 718-960-7261, or if you'd like, you can send an email to us at bronxtalk@bronxnet.org, or you post it on our Facebook page, and we'll read it on the air during a future edition of our program. For the here and now, he is currently a professor of criminal justice at Monroe College, but in the past he was an award-winning parole officer who has worked in and studied Homeland Security and is completing his doctoral dissertation on the relationship between terrorism and organized crime. Welcome to Professor Steve Eppolito. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
And also a security expert and international counterterrorism consultant who actually thwarted a suicide bombing a couple of years ago. Welcome back to Bronxtalk, Albert Timmon. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Professor Eppolito, let's start with you. I guess I'll just ask the general question. How safe are we in New York City?
We are relatively safe, given the time that we're in. Bill Bratton is an expert in policing, as you know. If anyone's going to keep New York City safe, it will be him. The question that might come up is, how does Bratton's expertise, which is considerable, you remember how he basically stopped the crime problem in New York back in the 90s.
There are those who would disagree with stopped it, but would say he impacted it significantly with CompStat and other innovations.
If you grew up in the Bronx like I did, living with 2,000 homicides a year, what he did was, was a virtual death stop.
I'm splitting hairs. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
He's the right man for the job. I think he's got his finger on it. My only concern is that he may run afoul of Mr. de Blasio and some of his ideas politically that might impact.
Really?
Yes. That's
you
a
think?
concern.
Now, listen. Stop and frisk and other, I guess, local crime-fighting issues are one thing. Do you think that the mayor's policies potentially could affect Bratton's approach to Homeland Security? I'd be shocked if the mayor. I mean, again, I realize the dialogue and some of the immediate policing concerns, but I'd be surprised if the mayor or anybody would do anything to impact our overall security.
I don't think he would do anything intentional to do that. I think the issues with policing is philosophical. Bratton's an old school cop. You may remember when he was in transit, he was very effective in curtailing robberies and things in transit, which frankly no one thought anyone could do. But he was able to do it with the help of, as you said, CompStat, the help of Jack Maples, who was kind of like an unsung genius in policing back in those days. Jack is deceased now, sorry to say. So I think that if he is able to carry out the program that he's carried out in other cities, I think we will.
You have great confidence in this police
I have a lot.
commissioner.
Yes.
He put out a rather detailed op-ed piece yesterday in the Daily News. This was in response to that whole dialogue with the political candidate Ted Cruz, and frankly, we're not going to get into that aspect of it. But I found the op-ed piece fascinating because he detailed 5 different aspects of Homeland Security that I, as a layman, was not very familiar with. Talked about the Joint Terrorism Task Force,
Yes.
Critical Response Command, NYPD Counterterrorism Bureau, NYPD Intelligence Bureau, and the NYPD Domain Awareness System. Are these the best in the world? And we're going to ask a gentleman who has been in Israeli counterterrorism,
Well,
who may have something
yes.
to say about that. But we are touted as having the absolute best systems of anybody anywhere.
Well, we have a very, very effective system. I have the enormous respect for what goes on in Israel, for what they deal with on a regular basis there. The combination of security, intelligence, the military, and all that. We have a very excellent group of people, and we have a very excellent program. The NYPD is an extraordinary organization, and plus it doesn't work alone. It works with other agencies, and I mean, think about it. It's like the size of 2 Army divisions. It's got its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own intelligence bureau, and so on. There are police who are in different countries today. So it's a very effective force. I think it's up to the job.
So, we see, let's say, a bombing in overseas, and all of us, in fact, I was on a very crowded subway train this morning, and I was sitting in there, and you think of the horror that could be. How are we able, and frankly, since 9/11 in New York City, we haven't really had, I mean, I looked it up, and I think there were 20 thwarted terror possibilities since that time.
Yes.
How are we able to keep it safe when it just seems so crowded and so random, and frankly, any lunatic could be out there?
Well, you may remember in 1997, the NYPD, the Emergency Service Unit, was able to stop 2 Palestinian brothers that were connected to Hamas. One was Abu Mazer. They had built a bomb. They were going to detonate the bomb as it got into one of the tunnels. I mean, there would have been a catastrophic loss of life. The police just happened to get certain information that brought them there. They were able to stop all this. The key, I think, is intelligence. The key is to mobilize the communities. The key is to work with the other agencies and just follow up on every lead that you might have.
We have laid the groundwork to our friend Albert Timmon and let him in to some of these things, and I'm going to get back to this idea of the subways and some of the technology involved. First of all, I hadn't anticipated this question, but it's come up. Comparing, let's say, New York City's preparedness in the Homeland Security and maybe what there is in Israel, and certainly the Israeli forces have been renowned over the world.
Correct. Well, in comparison, there's a lot of things that have been happening in Israel and now being repeated here or being duplicated or being
You think that
copied
was
from.
the source of a lot of the tactics?
I think that a lot of things that happened in the 70s in Israel, and we've been, since that time, we've been thinking ahead of everybody else in the world, because unfortunately we've been fighting this fight
For a longer
period of time than anybody else. And our security systems and our nation and our people around Israel, they understand that everybody has a very, very specific responsibility in this, kind of relationship to how it's been, laid out in terms of how comfortable you want to be, your civil liberties and whatnot is going to be one thing, but when it comes to security, how you weigh your things around it. So in Israel, we found a formula, obviously, that is the least evasive to the person. And this is, of course, comes to politics that goes around it. But obviously, we want to keep everyone safe in face of what we're seeing on a daily basis. So concerns of the general population of who's the attacker, first of all. So my colleague here has mentioned intelligence, which is a big part of how we play this game. We don't want to play defensive. If we really want to go forward and understand,
even though it is defense, you're
it
saying
is defensive
a good defense
in
is
nature,
a good offense.
but I think that if we play defensive, we're waiting for the perpetrator or the adversary to take initiatives, and this is where we need to kind of change the entire thought about how we kind of see this.
Just to follow the original thought, and then we'll move on. Is there a tactic or a concept that you think was developed by the Israelis, even as far back as in the 70s, that has been adopted and put into a reasonably good use here in the States?
Absolutely. It's called the layered security or rings of security or multi-layered security that we see today being in effect all over the world.
What is that? How does that work?
Well, we're talking
Without
about
giving all the secrets away.
the concept is to have more than one layer of security or the visible security that we see, the person that checks us or asks us the question, or we see the uniformed security or law enforcement personnel with the fully equipped. And that's a deterrent. That's one of the things that needs to be done. And obviously we see also in international airports, we see that the presence of visible security. But what we don't see is the outer side of the invisible security that is also things that we don't want to expand the talk about. But there's certain ways that you can, increase the amount of presence and security in the given protected area or environment by multiplying the force, the protection of the environment by other elements that are not being.
So you think there are levels of security? I think we would assume there are levels of security that the everyday person is not aware of. I'll ask you the same question that I opened the show with. How safe are we in New York? Do you feel that maybe the biggest obvious terrorist target in the world, New York City, is safe, and that our subways are safe? And I went to the World Series this year, and there were soldiers with long guns and things like that. Do you feel that we're safe?
I think that most of the effort here is invested in the right place. The one that we have at hand, I think that most of it falls on the law enforcement agencies to do the job, and unfortunately they're always understaffed for this type of mission. I have a lot of respect of of what's been done so far. There's again, we're not talking about the adversary that we've been working against in the past. This is a much more sophisticated and a much more advanced creation of terrorism. It's been taking its own shape and form. We haven't seen these type of operations before. These guys are going with the encrypted phones, and they have their own terror cells that they develop and their own intelligence. It's very hard to penetrate this level of operational level, but I think on the other side, we do need to give the credit where credit is due. There's people here working on around the clock to keep us safe. Law enforcement agencies are being on the job and on the task. How much we can really expect from them to give more? I think this is something that we need to weigh and again put on the context of how we are really upgrading our systems, the existing systems, not just kind of going around it, but it's upgrading it.
A new style of terrorism was unveiled, I guess it was over the summer in San Bernardino, and the concept used to be that people would come from other shores and come here and do damage. That was a case of people who lived here, maybe they originally were from somewhere else, but they lived here and they seemed to be integrated into our society, and their minds were turned and somehow unleashed this horrible terror. Is that a new style of terrorism, or maybe I'm asking the obvious? It is a new style of terrorism, and how are we able to deal with that so that people will say, well, you know what, some lunatic in my neighbor could very well be doing something horrible?
But this is again exactly what we've been facing in Israel since the creation of the state. We have elements within the society, within the Israeli society. We're not talking about around the border. We're talking about within the Israeli society that radicalize themselves or being, recruited by others, and they become, homegrown, as we call them today. Different type of attack scenarios that we can see is the emergence of the lone wolf. We've seen that here in the past. It's very, very hard to deal with the pinpoint intelligence if a person doesn't have any prior or previous interaction with the law, and if he's not perceived as a threat before. So we can see even people that go overseas come back, and even today in the age of internet and whatnot, social networking, people are being radicalized at home.
Right.
in their own.
And presumably, we do hear, and I think it's remarkable that we hear that they were aware of so-and-so along the way because they had been monitoring social media and everything else. Professor Eppolito, in terms of those kinds of, stopping those kinds of terrorists who may be, God forbid, infiltrating our society, I always thought that the notion of weaponry, the minute you begin to gather an arsenal of some sort. Nowadays, of course, the proliferation of guns is one thing, but if you get explosive material, that to me would be a tip-off, and that a good intelligence, and this is again from somebody who's a layman, good intelligence would monitor that material. Is that one way that we're getting to the bottom?
That is a possible way. The issue here, remember, we're a gun culture here in America. We're a Second Amendment country, so these issues become they become a little delicate but I agree that there are certain things that if people are using them and they're not for any obvious purpose like construction or whatever, then there should be some mechanism to track these things and who's getting them in order to do just as you say, keep us safe. Is
an obvious target like New York more likely to be the victim of a terror attack, or so-called softer targets like smaller towns or cities, or that horrible bombing in Pakistan that was in a playground?
Yeah, in a playground, women and children, yeah.
So right now, in your mind, do you say anything is obvious, or is everything on the table at this point?
Well, I think everything's on the table. I think a city like New York will always be a very attractive target, not simply because it's a big city, but because if you do damage in New York City, you recall 9/11, what happened after the towers were hit. I mean, there was a real economic impact as well.
Sure.
It wasn't just the loss of life and infrastructure. So if you can tie up a whole city, tie up its commerce, cause all these types of problems, which, by the way, is a symptom of what you refer to as the new terrorism, which is a term that's actually being used since the end of the Cold War. Yeah, New York would be a target, but I think in the final analysis, if we can do a lot of destruction pretty much anywhere, I think some people will want to do that.
One of the biggest controversies now brought on by the political dialogue, the rather extraordinary political dialogue in our country, is the idea of investigating Muslim communities. Bratton says they don't. Of course, the NYPD was criticized a little while back, and in fact, I think there was a lawsuit about them targeting Muslim communities. What's your vision of that? And then he, of course, defended it in the Daily News this week and said, we look at everything. Is it a good idea to pick out certain communities and say, you know what, this is where it comes from. We may as well take a closer look at them.
Well, that's an interesting question. The issue here is that truly when you do surveillance, you don't surveil neighborhoods. You surveil individuals. You surveil groups. You surveil organizations. Now, if they happen to be in a particular area, well, then that's where you will go.
So you don't do it based on what has been out there that, well, they're Muslims, so we go into the mosque. And
not specifically, no. You, in order to
you follow the lead wherever the lead is.
Remember, if you get some sort of information on an individual or a group of individuals or some type of an organization, then that's where you will take it. You see, otherwise you wind up becoming an army of occupation. Why are we in a neighborhood just to keep an eye on everyone? That's not practical.
Mr. Timon, one of the things that came through to me based on what you gentlemen were talking about when I think about, again, riding the subway or anywhere in New York City, and you're talking about the importance of intelligence, seems to me some of it, if not a large part of it, has to come from a partnership with the general public. Is that a large part of it, or I guess does the law enforcement community and the Homeland Security industry wish they had more?
Well, first of all, I think
always want more.
I think that the biggest asset in intelligence is the human factor. This is what you want to affect. This is what you want to recruit. This is what you want to work with. In terms of the mission profile, if you're here to find the radicalized groups or the radicalized individuals, you have to have leads. Who's going to give you these leads? Who's going to be involved in actually being care about these, instances that we're talking about? So I think that educational aspects and working within the communities, and you mentioned the Muslim community. I think that one of the biggest interests of these Muslim communities should be working with the police and actually throwing out all these radicalized elements and actually coming out and really not giving them a safe haven or a comfortable place to grow in. And
including the mosques.
Including the mosques, which are a major recruitment.
I have to interject for folks who were watching our show. A little while back, we had an imam from a Bronx mosque, and this was when there was a lot of talk of Islamophobia and things like that. And he said, you know what? He said, I and my congregants, my people, we would be the best friends you ever had. Instead of coming in from the top and surveilling us, maybe if you would talk to us, we'll help you. If there are, we would help you if you would form a partnership. You're shaking your head. Presumably you agree with that.
Absolutely. I agree 100%.
A chain is as strong as its weakest link. It has been almost embarrassing to read in the aftermath of the attacks in Brussels that they missed opportunities. Now that we're all finding out, that New York City may have one attitude toward its subways or its security, but in Brussels they didn't. Does the security or lack thereof in places like Belgium or other countries in Europe impact us here, or is it really separated by the ocean and let it stay that way?
I think that what happened in Europe in the last year and a half, 2 years, is being a wake-up call waiting to happen, and these guys unfortunately had to have it, to this extent in order to wake up somehow. Really, I think that we've been preaching the same over and over all over the world because we've been in the forefront of fighting terrorism. Israel as a state, as a nation, is being a model throughout, and I think now you hear voices even calling from Europe and within here in the United States. Let's start to see what these Israelis are talking about for years now. And I think that now, it's always something really major has to happen in order to, do some changes. So I think that change is imminent now, and I think the Europeans will pick up now, hopefully. And again, if we're not playing old politics, someone or somehow within the system in Europe, they will wake up and really start to understand that they have harbored the potential of explosive potential there. They've been, the entire situation from the Middle East and the entire, geographical areas, geopolitical, has been changing. With a wave of immigration, illegal immigration, it's changed the societies, and I think that now, the society is much more susceptible to these type of events because of that.
Do you have a greater concern about chemical attacks than a more traditional kind of terrorist attacks, or it's all the same? You just
I think the ease of access would be, and the ease of operational, execution of the, whatever, might be, is the main issue here. If they can get their hands on, chemical, if they can get their hands on radiological capabilities,
they will.
They will. So that's not going to stop them. We had already the peak of 9/11.
That's the new terrorism.
Professor, I was interested because I didn't get to talk to you about it beforehand, and I'm interested in this idea of what your dissertation is about, which is the relationship, you say, between terrorism and organized crime. Yes. You want to just give us something on that, help us understand what that's about?
The crime-terror nexus, that's what we're referring to. This is a phenomenon that developed after the Cold War. We started to see that take place. What happened when the Soviet Union collapsed? Many of the groups that they used to sponsor lost their funding. So that put them in a situation where they now had to go out basically and earn their daily bread.
Oh, I know where you're going.
In order to survive. The model that they adopted developed primarily in Central Asia and in Latin America, drug trafficking, or what the president of Argentina, I believe it was, referred to as narco-terrorism. What we saw is that in the 80s and 90s, in places like Sicily, in places like Colombia, the level of violence that emerged around narcotics trafficking was so extraordinary that they called it terrorism.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't want to take more time on it because we're going to run out of time, but that is fascinating. So what you're saying is they then turn to another type of crime and use that to fund their terror networks. Do you think we're going to see that as we in America keep hitting the leaders of ISIS? We realize that's not eliminating ISIS, but if we take their money and we take their leadership, then they'll continue to turn to organized crime?
ISIS is a perfect example of this. The human trafficking, the slavery that they're using, where they're buying and selling people and things of that sort, that's an example. 9/11, but most people are not aware that the 1993 World Trade Center bombing was in part funded by the sale of illegal T-shirts and cigarettes right here in Manhattan.
So there's the network. Before we run out of time, do you have concerns where we're most vulnerable?
I have concerns every day. I have concerns every day.
I guess we all do, right?
Listen, my son Brian was a Marine for 8 years. He served in Iraq twice. He's now a New York City fireman. You know, everywhere he goes, he'll always be there. I'm concerned for him, for family members, for my students.
When you hear the talk about potentially defunding the terror effort in New York, that concerns you?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
I think it would have to.
I mean, New York City is such a vital area for business, for commerce, that if we get hit again, as in 9/11, there's not just the cost in infrastructure and lives. You're going to be paying an economic cost. You'll be paying costs on many different levels.
Mr. Timman, everyday New Yorkers, I'll give you the final word. Everyday New Yorkers who are watching this are saying, I would love to help. Is there anything everyday New Yorkers can do? Is it the bottom line? If you see something, say something. Stay vigilant.
Absolutely. This is the main assets that we can use free of charge. Force multipliers. Everybody has eyes, ears, and they need to use them, and mainly to use their brain. We are so invested in our own personal, daily routines that we don't even bother to give a second glance or a second thought about
maybe it's
that
time
person
we started doing that.
or that object around us. So there's more to be more aware of our surroundings, definitely. And
Professor Steve Eppolito from Monroe College, thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary.
Counterterrorism expert Albert Timman, welcome back to the show, and thank you so much.
Thank you again.
And folks, if you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on the show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at bronxtalk@bronxnet.org, or put them on our Facebook page, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. We ask you to like Bronx Talk on Facebook, and you can check out our archives at bronxnet.org. You find Bronx Talk on the lower right navigation bar. So we want to thank our producer, Jayla Juberis, also director is Shirley Arietta, Helen and Neilani, and the cast of Thousands. And guess what? We'll see you next week.
If you want to stay in the know about the latest happenings en español, check out Diálogo Abierto, BronxNet's own Spanish show, Wednesdays 6:30 p.m. on Channel 67. The latest in news, arts, culture, politics, and what's going on in your neighborhood. Diálogo Abierto, the best way to stay connected in Spanish. See you there.